Joe Biden has led the 2020 Democratic primary polls since before he even announced his candidacy. The latest poll showing him with a 12-point lead. And with the first debates less than 3 weeks away, his competitors are going on the offense, drawing increasingly sharper policy contrasts with the former vice president. But as the New York Times highlights, quote, "You'd be forgiven if you missed it," because they almost never mention Mr. Biden by name. His opponents have begun the delicate footwork of going on the attack without appearing as the aggressor, turning to euphemisms, translucent critiques, and at times all but winking. They are hoping the voters and news media will pick up on their implicit message in a way that doesn't also sully them in the process the tables back. Is this smart? Is this the way to go? This feels like a ground game, because you talk to voters, they like Biden a lot more than the political press would suggest.
No, I think it is smart. Not only the fact that a lot of the voters like Biden, the fact that they dislike Trump so, right, that they don't want anyone to try and get any distraction from what is perceived as the enemy, which is Trump. And I think that people are being very careful, I'm talking about the candidates, not to appear to be the one that breaks rank. The real test is going to be at the debates, because how are you going to distinguish yourself, especially if you're on the stage with Biden, especially if you're one of these that are doing very low in the polls. How does anybody even remember you're there unless you throw a Hail Mary? And that could get a little testy and divisive. And how will Biden respond? Last night, I spoke at the African American Summit, and he spoke as well. And he is a testy fighter when he's attacked. I think he's stayed on the high road, but he's not going to be one, I think, that's going to stand up there and not answer an attack. I don't think he'll get in the mud, but I don't think he's also the kind of guy that won't respond. So that's going to be the test.
Well,
what happens in the debate.
Let me press you, and let me bring everybody in on this. I mean, I feel like there's a disconnect right now between how we cover Biden. There's been about 48 hours of near hysterical coverage of his change in position on the Hyde Amendment. When he changed position, not just for himself, but also for the entire Obama White House on marriage equality, he was celebrated as a hero. His position evolves. When you spend a long time in public life, positions evolve, and he's being slammed. I saw a spokesperson for his campaign really on the defensive. I mean, is there a gap between what voters think about Biden and a change in position? You're nodding. I mean, what?
Yeah. So literally, I've had these conversations with members of Team Biden. It's like, look, in the real world, my friends in Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, who don't do this on a regular basis, they don't care about the Hyde Act. Yeah. They don't care about the 1994 crime bill. They just think he's Uncle Joe. They think he's a nice guy.
Can I be crude? They don't care about Anita Hill.
No, they don't care about any of those things.
I'm not saying they should. No judgment. Yeah. But voter mentality. They look at Biden. Exactly. They like the message. They like the legacy. And they like what you just described. They like the fighter.
Yeah, they like the fighter. And here's the thing. People are forgetting what he did to Paul Ryan. Okay, he took down a kid half his age, right, and was very good in those debates. So you can't just go for Joe Biden in these debates. He will be able to defend himself. I'm actually kind of curious when everyone's making these sort of vague, okay, well, we can't go into the past, we can't into the future. I'm wondering who's going to be the John Kasich, who's going to be the Dick Gephardt, who's going to take the suicide pact and be like, you know what, I'm not winning, I'm just going to go straight for him in the debate, because someone's going to make that decision. How he responds to that person, I think, will sort of determine whether Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris or anybody else does.
I think that there are voters and there are voters, right? The Democratic nominating electorate is, we talk about, well, people say this, people that, well, the Democratic nominating electorate is to the left of where Joe Biden is on a lot of issues historically. That is a fact. There's no doubt about it. That doesn't mean he can't be the Democratic nominee for a lot of other reasons, because people think he's the best one to take on Trump, whatever. He could run the table and become the Democratic nominee. But the question going into this has always been, when the party has moved as far as it has to the left, especially at the activist level, whether this series of issues on which Biden is to the right of them, whether that was going to be a problem. This is the first time when that has become a problem. It's not going to be the last. You saw Seth Moulton with the tweet today. Now it's Seth Moulton. He's at 0% of the polls. He's not even going to qualify for the debate. But when he made that point, which is the point that all these Democrats are making, welcome, you're on the right side now, the Hyde Amendment, great. What about the Iraq War? Now, the Iraq War took down Hillary Clinton against
Right.
Barack Obama in 2008. And you could say there are a lot of Democrats who were for the Iraq War, but in the Democratic nominating electorate, that was the main thing. That was a point of policy distinction between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So we're going to talk about the Iraq War and Joe Biden, and I know we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about impeachment, where everybody who's above 2% in the polls, except for maybe Amy Klobuchar, and Joe Biden is now four square for an impeachment inquiry. So that question, Joe Biden, why are you not where Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Bernie Sanders, all the rest of them, all the rest.
Yeah.
The top Democrats are now four square for an impeachment inquiry. Joe Biden, the front runner, is not. He's going to get questions about the Iraq War. Is he going to change his position? He's going to get pushed on this. This is a dynamic that's going to play out, and it is going to be the central political challenge for Joe Biden to confront. I think he did fine this week, and I don't think it's going to hurt him at all. But I will tell you that this is the thing for months going forward. Whether he's attacked directly or attacked obliquely, he's going to be answering questions over and over again about, is he where the Democratic Party is today, or is he where the Democratic Party was and where he was comfortably situated for most of his career?
But here's the problem.
Corinne, let me get Corinne in.
Okay.
So, I mean, you hit it right on the nail. The problem is that he's the front runner. That's it. If he was at 1%, nobody would care what Joe Biden's 40-year career was. He's the front runner. And we're in a situation where the media, we cover Donald Trump, he's the president of the United States, 90% of the time. So 10% of that airtime, those 20-plus candidates have to fight for it. I mean, that really is where we are right now. And so you have, and the other reason why he's the front runner is because people want to beat Donald Trump. They believe that Joe Biden is going to do that. They remember the legacy of Obama. It makes them feel good. It brings them back to a certain time. And I do have to give him credit. He did the right thing by going back on the Hyde Amendment. It really, really is. Because you have to remember, women came out in 2018, and women are going to play a big role, in particular black women. So that was a right move for him. And if he's talking about white working class, and he's trying to hold on to that African-American base, he can't be for the Hyde Amendment.
No, and he did it well. He did it last night at the dinner I referred to, but I think we're missing one thing, because I've been on that stage in the presidential debates. It is not just which questions are raised. It's who raises them.
Sure. Right.
Because if you have somebody that people don't see as having standing or familiarity, they don't care what they raise. They don't know who some of these people are. And they're looking at Joe Biden, Barack Obama's vice president, who was there and got the gay marriage through, and this, that, and the other, and this is a big effing deal with health care. And some guy or lady they never heard of is trying to beat up on Uncle Joe, who was with Barack. That's the problem. You've got to remember, when Barack Obama took on Hillary Clinton had a lot of unfavorables, and Barack Obama was the rising star, black in the Senate. He had stature. You don't have everybody getting on that stage that has the stature to take a punch at anything other than somebody in the audience, and they hope they don't do that.
But you saw it this week when all of them put themselves on the side of the Hyde Amendment. Not any of them has Joe Biden's stature, but when all of them this week said, we're for repealing the Hyde Amendment, we're not for the Hyde Amendment, he moved.
But I don't think he moved because of them. I think he moved because of what Corinne said, because of black women, which is why he waited. Which is why, John, he waited and changed in front of the African American Summit last night.
Exactly.
He did not respond to the camera. He went in that black audience. He had a script, and he says, before I do that, and he put the script down, and he started talking about the Hyde Amendment, which is where he should have played. He didn't respond to them.
Yeah, he didn't care about that.
Last word.
Yeah, so Joe Biden is, as Corinne said, he is the front runner, but his biggest concern right now, in the midst of all this, is what happens when you become Mr. Inevitable, right? The first time you screw up is when you really fall off the cliff, and that's what happened to Hillary Clinton. He has the biggest danger he's got right now, he has to look like he's still working for this, because if he looks like he's going to coast, people will come after him, even within the activist community and on the ground in key primary states.
All right. No one's going anywhere. Don't worry. Don't worry. We just had this.
They won't come after Corinne's on the stage.
Thank you. I was waiting for you to get it in there.
I was biding my time.
I was like, you got it first, man. You got it first.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.